Anybody want to start?
I will volunteer, sir.
Perfect. Right. Rest all, please put your mics on mute. We'll start the station. So this patient is an elderly male coming for lap cholecystectomy. So he's got known case of ischemic heart disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and a pacemaker is being placed. So the pacemaker details has been noted to be it is D, 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 and R. Okay. What is this second letter D denotes?
This dual chamber sensed.
Okay. It is a dual chamber.
Sensed.
Perfect. So that is the sensing chamber. That's the second D. What does the first D denote?
A dual chamber pacing.
Okay, so that's a pacing letter. Second one is going to be the sensing letter. And what does the third D denotes?
That is triggering and also inhibition. Both the actions are done by.
It is the response to the sensing. Okay, either it's going to be trigger or it is going to get suppressed or it's going to get ignored. Fine. And what does the word R denotes?
R stands for rate modulation. When the demand increases, it can increase the heart rate.
Okay, so depending upon the body's expected demand, the pacemaker can adjust the response and it can increase the heart rate. Okay, so generally the sensors for rate modulation, there are many, like changes in the right atrial contraction, changes in the body temperature, changes in the respiration. So many parameters are there. Newer parameters are getting more and more miniature, more and more complex in detecting this rate demand. Okay, clear about those things. Perfect. So you have said what are the second letter denotes, and you have said what does R denotes. Okay, can you tell me what is the name of this part?
That is the pulse generator.
That is called as the pulse generator. Very good. Do you know the material makeup of this pulse generator?
No, sir.
Okay, it is made up of lead. Okay, lead or the titanium oxide. So that is the material makeup of this pulse generator, which is the main life for the battery. Okay, good. And what is this one? This is called as the leads, right? So this is pulse generator, this is leads, and this white structure is nothing but the electrodes. Okay, that is the electrodes. So these are the three basic parts of a pacemaker or implantable cardioverter and defibrillator. Good. What are the precautions in using diathermy when a patient with pacemaker?
It can change the mode.
Okay, what type of diathermy you use? Okay, what are the important problems of using a diathermy?
Monopolar and bipolar. In bipolar, it is a short circuit, so it can reach in the it start and end at the very narrow point.
Okay.
When using monothermy, it passes through the whole body and it passes to the earth plate we have placed on the patient.
Okay. Do you think we cannot use monopolar?
We can use when the
first question. Let me tell me which diathermy is safe: bipolar cautery or unipolar cautery?
Bipolar is more safe.
Okay, bipolar is more safe, right? So why bipolar is safe? Okay, so you got a bipolar cautery catheter here. So current passes from one electrode to another end. When they catch the tissue in between the two electrodes, the current passes through the tissues and gets dissipated away from the other end. So the circuit is completed within this tips of the bipolar cautery. So this is bipolar. So since it is starting and ending at the same point, so it doesn't cross across any part of the body. That is why bipolar cautery is very safe. What is the problem with the unipolar cautery? Where does the current starts and where does the current ends?
It starts at the our diathermy here.
Okay, it starts at the diathermy tip. Okay, where does it end?
And it ends at the patient's earth plate, which we have placed it.
So we put a earth pad on the patient's leg or wherever it is. So the current, when they dissipate the electric current at the tip of the electrode, it coagulates or cauterizes the tissues. Okay, once it gets cauterized tissue, the current passes and gets dissipated via this earth electrode. Okay, this is a simple basic mechanism. So when this passage of electric currents is going to move across the body, right? And going to move across the body, when it is going to cross the cardiac action potential, like this, say for example, if you're putting a diathermy in the leg, okay, the plate in the leg, and you're operating somewhere in the breast, what happens, when you stimulate the unipolar cautery, that is going to cross through the heart and then it's going to get dissipated away. So when such type of electrical interference happens to the pacemakers, they might sense it as a cardiac potential and they can get reacted. Okay, so that is the problem of unipolar diathermy. Okay, In such cases where there is no use of, where there is no bipolar diathermy is available, you are forced to use only unipolar diathermy. What are the precautions you take?
Should be 15 centimeters away from the
Okay, so
pulse generator.
the maximum you have to use at least 15 centimeter away from the pulse generator. First thing, right? Then,
And use it in frequent, small, short bursts.
okay, you have to use 1 to 2 seconds continuously a burst. Between the second burst, there must be a gap interval of 15 seconds. Okay, so one burst should last for not more than 2 seconds, and the second burst should happen minimum interval of 15 seconds. Okay, right. Then next precaution.
You can place the earth plate very near to the
Okay, so you
operating.
say for example, if you're operating in the distal radius, you can keep the earth plate here. So the current starts here, get dissipated and comes it and reaches the earth plate and gets dissipated. Okay, so it never crosses the cardiac axis. In that cases, it is more safer. Of course, in all cases not possible, but whenever possible, try to make sure that the current doesn't crosses across the cardiac axis. That's the simple logic. Very good. Bipolar is safe. Unipolar can be used, but make sure it is 15 centimeter away minimum. And use single burst should not last not more than 2 seconds. And the subsequent burst interval should be minimum of 15 seconds. All right. And try to make sure the current circuit is well away from the cardiac axis. So this interference, okay, this type of interference from diathermy on the pulse generator, we call them as the electromagnetic interference. Okay. So electromagnetic, apart from diathermy, what are the other things which can produce electromagnetic interference?
Lithotripsy, laser waves.
Good. Lithotripsy surgeries, right? Lithotripsy. Then
MRI.
MRI scanning, right? Excellent. Very good. Then when you're using the TURP, TURP surgery, the coagulation, cautery used in the TURP, right? Then when you're operating or when you're doing the TENS therapy. Oh shit, whose mic is that? Okay, so when you're using TENS, okay, for chronic pain, okay, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, TENS therapy, then when the patient is coming for electroconvulsive therapy, right? And lastly, when you're doing nerve blocks, okay, nerve stimulator. So these are the occasions where you have to be very careful, where they can have the electromagnetic interference with the pacemakers. Lovely. Mention few anesthesia drugs which has to be used very cautiously.
Succinylcholine.
Succinylcholine. Why? Okay, it is going to produce fasciculation. Succinylcholine. Then.
And etomidate, it can cause myoclonus.
Okay, it can got myoclonus. Excellent. Etomidate and ketamine. Both can cause myoclonic movements and succinylcholine. So those has to be used carefully and precautiously. Then any other gas?
Nitrous oxide, because it can fill the air pocket.
Okay, right. So at the initial phase, inside the pulse generator, it can expand the air pockets and damage the battery. Very good. Excellent. Nitrous oxide. Lovely. What is the effect of applying magnet?
It will convert it to an asynchronous mode.
Okay. Say, for example, if this patient, this patient is dual chamber sensing and dual chamber pacing. And the response to the sensing is going to be either if it is sensing and atrial intrinsic pacemaker, either it can inhibit that pacemaker or it can stimulate or it can stop its own delivery of electric current. So that is how it has been sensed. So say, for example, if you're using a dual chamber pacemaker, like atrium is being sensed, atrium is being paced, atrium is being sensed, and the response is going to be triggered. If you have this type of pacemaker, what happens, whenever they use diathermy, this electric current will be the myoclonic moments, electric currents will be sensed by the sensing chamber as an atrial contraction, and that will what happens, since you set it in a trigger mode, it will give additional stimulus apart from the native intrinsic heartbeat. What happens, when you have a multiple stimulus at the same time, when the stimulus is reaching the relative refractory period, which we spoke in the previous class, what happens, it produces subsequent stimulus, and that can result in ventricular arrhythmias. So in order to avoid that, what happens, when you apply an external magnet, it's a round shaped circular magnet. When you apply an external magnet on the pulse generator, it will activate a switch called reed switch, which is inside the pulse generator. So when you activate the reed switch, what happens, it will go to asynchronous mode or AOO mode, which means it will ignore all the intrinsic heart impulses. It will work in a demand rate. For example, if you set a rate of 60 per minute, it will generate the pacing at 60 per minute, irrespective of the patient's contraction. So this is called asynchronous mode or demand mode or backup mode. So by applying magnet, you are putting the patient back to asynchronous mode, which means you are not depending upon the patient's cardiac impulse at all. The machine will continuously stimulate produces the electrical potential depending upon the heart rate you set in the pulse generator. So that is the effect of applying magnet. So what purpose of applying is when the patient is coming for an emergency surgery, right? So some patients will have an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, which means when it is finding a tachyarrhythmia, it will deliver a shock. Okay, so that is a feature of cardioverter defibrillator. So when you're using a diathermy here at this stage, what happens, this electrical potential will be sensed by this pulse generator as a tachyarrhythmia. What happens, unnecessarily the patient will receive a shock. So in order to avoid that, apart from applying magnet, you have to switch off the shocking function of the pulse generator. Okay, so switch off the anti-tachycardia response. First thing you have to do when the patient is coming for surgery. Okay, when you don't have time, you can apply the magnet and you can put the pacemaker in the demand mode. But if you have enough time, the first thing you have to do is switch off the anti-tachycardia response. Okay, that's the first thing. And activate the demand mode, which is the asynchronous mode or the backup mode. These are the two things we have to do when the patient is coming for elective surgery. When there is an emergency surgery where you don't have time to reprogram the pulse generator, you can apply a magnet so that the magnet takes the pulse generator to a fixed mode. Do you understand this point? Rest all unmute and tell me.
Sir, can you repeat, sir? It was a bit fast.
Okay, so let's coming elective surgery. Let's assume that elective surgery and emergency surgery, right? What happens in elective surgery? What you have to do is you have to make sure two things. Okay, find the type of the pacemaker, why it is inserted. All details are theoretical thing. Okay, first thing you have to suspend is switch off the anti-tachycardia function. Okay, right? Anti-tachycardia function, which means when the patient is having tachyarrhythmia, the pulse generator will give a shock. So that function has to be switched off in an electric surgery, because when you use an electrode or when there is any extra muscular potential, that will be falsely detected by the pulse generator and can deliver a shock. So in order to avoid that, switch off the anti-tachycardia function first. Then get the pacemaker to the demand mode. Okay, which means a fixed mode or an asynchronous mode. So which means it will ignore all the patient's native impulses. So it will deliver a pacemaker potential at the rate you fix in the pulse generator. These are the two things. When the patient is coming for an emergency surgery, when you don't have time to reprogram, you can apply an external magnet. So external magnet, as I said, when you apply a magnet on the pulse generator, it will take the pulse generator to an asynchronous mode or the demand mode or the fixed mode, and the reed switch will get activated. So these are the perioperative management of pacemaker when they come for, depending upon the type of surgery. Do you understand now?
So, sir, in MRI consoles, we should use magnets, sir.
In MRI, it is still they are trying to make MRI compatible, MRI safe pulse oximeters. But again, it depends upon what indication you're going to take MRI, if it is ideally needed. And so far, the safety of MRI pulse generator has not been established.
So it's risk versus benefit, sir.
Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Right. So that is the effect of applying magnet. When you apply magnet, whatever mode it is, it will take the pulse generator to a fixed mode. Okay, good. What are the factors affecting pulse capture? Pulse capture means the pulse generator will generate an electric potential. Okay, that electrical potential will stimulate the myocardial muscles, and then the action potential spreads across the ventricles or the muscles. Once the action potential generated across the muscle go for contraction. So the ability of the electrode to stimulate the ventricular muscles or the myocardial muscles is called as the pulse capture. Okay, so that is called pulse capture. There are certain factors which can increase pulse capture or certain factors which decrease the pulse capture. Factors which decrease the pulse capture are hypothermia, right? Hypoxia, hypoglycemia, hyperkalemia, right? Initial 1 to 4 weeks where the pacemaker has been implanted, for the initial 1 to 4 weeks, any acidosis or alkalosis. So these are the factors which can decrease the pulse capture, which means the pulse generator will generate the electrical potential, but the capturing capacity of the heart will be very poor when you have this type of problem. So that is why make sure the patient is not hypoxic. make sure the patient is not hyperkalemic, make sure the glucose is normal, make sure the temperature is fine. Similarly, when it comes to increased capture, for example, when you set a pacemaker potential, in response to pacemaker potential, there will be excessive contraction. So that is going to be increased pulse capture. Examples are when there is excessive sympathetic system stimulation in the body, fever, anxiety, okay, and sympathomimetic agents like ketamine and then anticholinergics. So these are the few drugs which can increase the capture capacity of the pacemaker. What is CRT symbol used in pacemaker?
Cardiac
Sir-
resynchronization.
Yeah, I'll come to the point. It is called as the cardiac resynchronization therapy. Okay. So what is cardiac resynchronization therapy is this patients will have, what are these subset of patients are? The cardiac resynchronization therapy is used in a patient who has got a severe LV dysfunction. Okay. Severe LV dysfunction where the patient's ejection fraction is less than 35%. Like a patient who's got a dilated cardiomyopathy or post myocardial infarction. When the patient's EF is less than 35%, what happens? There will be 3 leads. One will be in the right atrium, one will be in the septum. There will be another lead which is coming through the coronary sinus and stimulate the left ventricle lateral wall. What happens? In patients with myocardial infarction with the EF of less than 35%, they'll have a discordant contraction, which means right ventricle will contract in one axis, left ventricle will contract in one axis. When there is a discordant contraction, the output will be very poor. So in order to make that contraction in a synchronized manner, this type of pacing is used. So that is specifically called as the cardiac resynchronization therapy. That is CRT. Okay, used in a patients with severe LV dysfunction with EF of less than 35% and patients in NY heart dyspnea grade 3 and 4 who are having grade 3 and 4 dyspnea despite maximal medical treatment. So only these 2 patients will benefit from cardiac resynchronization therapy. Yes, someone is asking me a doubt. You can ask me now.
Yes, sir. Sir, does shivering and convulsions are sensed as
Yes. So that is why we put them on fixed mode.
okay?
Yeah, shivering convulsion has to be definitely avoided. So that myopotential could be sensed by the pacemaker and can deliver a shock. So that is why switch off the anti-tachycardia function, get them to backup mode or the demand mode, reprogram it. Okay. Apart from these questions, they might ask you about the indications for pacemaker. They might ask you about the indications for cardiac defibrillator. Yes, any other questions?
Pulse capture is unwanted thing, no, sir?
Sorry?
Pulse capture is unwanted thing, no?
If sometimes if they might ask you in your viva, if possible, okay? If you
No, sir,
remember,
is it desired? Is it desired, this pulse capture?
is it desired in the sense I didn't understand your question.
Sir, it is not a useful thing, no? Pulse capture is not a useful thing.
Pulse capture is a useful thing because, say, for example, if your patient is having a 6.5, okay, or the patient is having a blood sugar of less than the prescribed, which is less than 80 milligram. What happens, those patients who are getting hypoglycemia, electrode, the pulse generator will generate electrode potential, but that is not captured properly. So what happens when the pulse capture is poor, when it is decreasing, that will eventually result in poor LV function. The patient will have all symptoms of hypoperfusion.
There should be some desired cutoff level of the pulse capture.
I think he's asking, is it pulse capture is a normal phenomenon?
Yeah, it's happened. So any electrolyte abnormalities, any acid-base abnormalities will affect the function of pacemaker. So all those things has to be definitely corrected. The most important which is going to affect the pulse capture is going to be the potassium level. So never put the patient on hypokalemic, never put the patient on hyperkalemia.
So is it the same as
What I mean to say is the pulse capture is a normal thing for a body. Pulse capture.
Pulse capture is a normal thing for the body. I'm not able to. Can you put a question in a different way? Okay, so normally understand. Okay, normally, for example, if you fix a rate of 75 per minute, okay, if you fix a pulse voltage output of 75 per minute, okay, so this will calculate the time variation at the time of when you have to start working. So the pulse generator will initiate an electrical potential, okay, it will generate a depolarization at the point where it is getting stimulating the concern wall. If you're going to be right atrium, it will generate a pole of, a wave of potential at this point. So thus depolarization potential is picked up by the surrounding muscle and then the action potential propagates. That's how it starts working. So this capturing ability, the generation of action potential and the ability to capture by the muscle surrounding. So that is what we called as the pulse capture. That pulse capture is affected by so many factors which I discussed previously.
So is it able to find a type of the pacemaker based on X-ray?
Based on X-ray, it is you can't find. You can find whether it's going to be dual chamber or single chamber. That's it. But the type, whether it's trigger inhibited, you have to get programmed.
Sir, suppose there is an outside hospital cardiac arrest and some layperson attaches AED pads on already
Okay, so
ICU
what
patient.
happens, if you are attaching AED, that's the next point I was about to tell. If you are planning to do a defibrillation, okay, and most important thing, whatever the type of surgery is going to be elective or emergency surgery, put the patient on fixed mode as said already, but always have the backup of transvenous and the transcutaneous quotation, transcutaneous stimulator for that. Okay, you have the backup of this one, and always have the external defibrillator. Okay, so if the patient is having, say for example, if you're doing an elective surgery, patient is having a ventricular fibrillation, but the machine will not deliver shock because you have reprogrammed it to, you have stopped the anti-tachycardia function. So how to manage in that case? So when there is an arrhythmia, so first thing you can do is you can reprogram immediately and you can get it back to the anti-tachycardia function. So once the anti-tachycardia function is activated, it will immediately deliver a shock. That is option one. Second thing, when that is not failing, you have to do an external defibrillation. When you're doing an external defibrillation, make sure the electrodes are placed at least 15 centimeter away from the pulse generator. Okay, so when one electrode is placed on the right chest wall, the other electrode can be, the other paddle can be placed behind, or it can be placed in the lateral wall such that it is 15 centimeter away minimum. That is important precaution, because otherwise it will damage the lead, it will damage the pulse generator.
Sir, how to reprogram it immediately?
Yeah, there is a lead. It's a Wi-Fi link. Okay, the pacemaker physician has to be there when you're doing the surgery, and they will teach you how to attach, get linked with the pulse generator. So once you reprogram it, once you get a Wi-Fi link with the system, you can, there is an option of reprogramming immediately, and you can switch it on the anti-tachycardia function.
Okay, sir.
Sir, R1T phenomenon, sir.
R1T phenomenon is nothing but, right? Right. So, as I said, the basic concept is going to be the absolute refractory period and relative refractory period. Okay. So until the QRS complex, okay, until this point, okay, major 1/3 of the QRS or the initial 2/3 of the QRS complex, it is going to, heart is going to be in the absolute refractory period. Okay. And the later of the QRS complex and ST segment is in the relative refractory period, right? So until this period, whatever extra bit of stimulus coming from the above, okay, or any extra bit of stimulus cannot stimulate the heart because it is in the absolute refractory period. Whereas when you come to the relative refractory period, any supramaximal stimulus can again stimulate the heart again. So those two stimulus gets clubbed and it can result in ventricular fibrillation. So that new incoming signal coming in the relative refractory period and making the patient have ventricular fibrillation is called as the R1T phenomenon, which is nothing but the R wave getting imposed on the T wave, which means the absolute refractory period, when it is getting converted to relative refractory period, at that point, any extra bit of stimulus can stimulate the heart again. That will result in ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia. That is R1T.
Sir, repeat, sir, please, sir.
Good. Right. So this is phase 0 in action potential. This is going to be phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? Sorry, this is going to be phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? So this initial upstroke is nothing but the opening of sodium channels, okay? So until this half of phase 2, this point is called as the absolute refractory period. So this is where you get the Q and major part of the R wave, okay? So until this period, it is absolute refractory period. Whatever extra stimulus which is coming to the heart cannot stimulate the heart again, okay? In the later half of the action potential, okay, where the remaining part of S wave and the T wave happens, okay. So this is repolarization, this is later half of depolarization. At this point, we call them as the relative refractory period, okay. So at this point, when the heart is in the relative refractory period, any extra stimulus happening, say for example, when there is an ectopic focus which is firing, so that ectopic focus, when it reaches the heart, when the heart is in the relative refractory period, it will produce another stimulus again. So these two stimulus will club together, that will eventually result in ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. So this type of phenomenon is called as the R&T phenomenon. So
Sir, does that apply for VPCs also, sir?
yes.
Sir, could you tell about the nomenclature once again, sir? Nomenclature.
Okay. So pacing, sensing, response, programmability, anti-tachycardia function. Okay. First chamber is going to be the pacing chamber. Second is going to be the sensing chamber. Third is going to be the response to the sensing. Fourth is going to be the programmability and the rate modulation. And the last is going to be the anti-shock or the anti-tachycardia response. Good. Let's move on to next session. Read the question. Who want to take up? We can start. Not so many sessions are there. We'll make it fast. First session itself took 30 minutes. Oh my God. No one is yet to find what is this.
HOCM, sir.
Okay, what's your name, dog?
Amar.
Okay, that's all. Please put in mind. Okay, so this is going to be very good. This is HOCM. Okay, excellent. What is the most common arrhythmia associated with hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy? Okay, don't worry, atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter. Okay, so this is the two common arrhythmias which can make the patient to have immediate cardiac arrest. Okay, atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter is not absolutely tolerated. So these are the most common arrhythmias which happens in a patient with hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Okay, what are the important anesthesia intraoperative goals in a patient with hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy? You could get this station, definitely possibilities are there.
Heart rate control, sir.
Okay, maintain the heart rate between
Maintain 60 to 80.
80 per minute. Okay, one.
Maintain preload and afterload.
Okay.
Afterload should not be reduced, sir. It should be maintained.
Okay, maintain the preload. Okay, or you can have the increased preload, but never decrease the preload. Third thing, maintain the afterload. Okay, never ever decrease afterload. Okay, never ever decrease afterload. Then last one, contractility. Okay, so don't increase the contractility or decrease the contractility. So these are the 4 important anesthesia goals which you have to maintain in a patient with hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. So hypovolemia, hypotension, tachycardia, fluid overload, arrhythmias, vasopressors, myocardial depressants. Okay, all this can result in sudden cardiac arrest, or a patient can have extremely severe cardiac compromise. So never make the patients hypovolemic. Never make the patient fluid overload is relatively well tolerated than hypovolemia. So never make the patient hypotensive, no tachycardia, and make sure the myocardial contractile is not depressed. Make sure the sinus rhythm is maintained, and never use myocardial depressants, or if at all, if you're using, we have to minimally use our drugs which have a minimal myocardial depression. Those are the drugs which are preferred. So when it comes to isoflurane, when it comes to volatile agents, isoflurane is the best preferred drug. because that produce minimal myocardial depression compared to other volatile agents. Good. So what is the first line of medical management in a patient with hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy?
Rate controls.
Yes. So what are the drugs you use?
Beta blocker.
Right. So the problem in the hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy is there will be asymmetrical septal hypertrophy. Okay. So when the ventricle is contracting and squeezing on all direction, when it tries to squeeze and contract and try to produce a left ventricular ejection output or left ventricular ejection, this the anterior mitral leaflet of mitral valve and the irregularly or the asymmetrical septal hypertrophy will oppose each other, and that will produce left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. So this is the basic pathology in hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Most important thing is this left ventricular outflow tract obstruction is a dynamic obstruction. Okay, which means when the heart is contracting very fast, okay, when the heart is contracting very fast, or when there is a tachycardia, what happens? This outflow tract obstruction becomes more severe. That is based upon the Bernoulli's principle. Okay, so when there is a rapid contraction, velocity is going to get more. When the velocity is going to get more, what happens to the pressure here? There is going to be the drop in the pressure. When there is a drop in the pressure, so that will oppose this anterior mitral leaflet and the asymmetrical septal hypertrophy more closer. So that will again result in left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. So that is why anything which increases, which produces tachycardia, anything which reduces the afterload, anything which reduces a preload, anything which is going to affect the myocardial contraction, and any rhythm disturbances, all will cause left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. So that is why you have to avoid all those things. So best thing is this, the first line of drug in the management is going to be the beta blockers. So by giving beta blockers, your first thing what you're going to do is you are slowing down the heart rate. By slowing down the heart rate, you are reducing the oxygen demand, first thing. Second thing, when you slow down the heart rate, the diastolic filling time is more. When the diastolic filling time is more, the left ventricular end diastolic diameter is going to get increased. So when the left ventricular end diastolic diameter is going to get increased, it can eject much better, because now the outflow tract obstruction gets much bigger. When the left ventricle is empty, the outflow tract obstruction becomes much severe. When the left ventricle is big and filled, the outflow tract obstruction becomes much smaller. So that is why maintaining adequate preload is more important. Okay. Everyone understood the pathology of hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy?
Yes, sir.
So beta blocker means we'll use beta 1 selective, right?
Yeah, beta 1 selective, preferably. Okay. So when you reduce afterload, so for example, if you're using a vasodilator, what happens when you use a vasodilator? Okay, at this point of dynamic obstruction, when you vasodilate here, what happens to the pressure here? It will drop much more. So when the pressure is dropping here much more, that will oppose the mitral leaflet and the ventricular septum even more closer. So that is why don't drop the afterload very severe or acutely. So acute reduction is afterload will exaggerate the dynamic outflow tract obstruction. Good. What are the important drugs which are contraindicated in managing hypertension? So for example, when the patient when the patient is having an hypotension, what is the preferred drug? Which drug is definitely avoided?
Phenylephrine is used. You have to use phenylephrine.
Okay. Why ephedrine is avoided?
Ephedrine increases heart rate, sir. Heart rate is not decided.
Dopamine.
Fine.
Mesentermin.
Okay. So the best preferred drugs are directly acting vasopressors. That's a simple example. Okay. That's a simple answer. So use directly acting vasopressors, which will go and act in the vessels directly, stimulate the alpha-1 receptors directly and squeeze the peripheral vessels. Okay. By squeezing the peripheral vessels, you are increasing the afterload. When you increase the afterload, you're going to open up the obstruction. We are going to release the obstruction much better. So always use directly acting vasopressors like phenylephrine and noradrenaline and mefentermine. So these are the directly acting vasopressors. So any indirectly acting vasopressors, like when you use an ephedrine.
Mefentermin causes tachycardia.
Mefentermine causes reflex bradycardia. It does not cause tachycardia. Mefentermine will act more on the alpha-1 receptors. It will act similar to phenylephrine. Okay. So by stimulating the alpha-1 receptors, it produces reflex bradycardia. So when you use an indirectly acting agents like ephedrine, okay, or when you use an adrenaline, okay. So adrenaline is a directly acting agent, but the problem with adrenaline is it can also produce tachycardia. So when you use an indirectly acting agent like ephedrine, so that will release in the sympathetic neurons the noradrenaline and adrenaline. So this will produce, apart from the vasoconstriction, they also increase the heart rate. So as I said, when you make the heart rate very fast, you don't have any time for the preload to fill. And when the heart is projecting fast, there will be a dynamic obstruction. So that will exaggerate the hypotension. So never use indirectly acting vasopressors. Always use directly acting vasopressors like phenylephrine or norepinephrine.
Sir, so vasopressin is also contraindicated.
Vasopressin is an indirectly acting agent. It acts, I mean, it's a directly acting agent. It is an absolutely best vasopressor to use.
Okay, sir.
Vasopressin lacked in the vasopressin receptors in the peripheral vessel. It will produce severe vasoconstriction. By producing vasoconstriction, it will have a reflex bradycardia. When there is a reflex bradycardia, you got enough time for the heart to fill. Preload is very good. The outflow tract obstruction will open up much better.
Yes, sir.
Good. Shall we move on to the next one? Right. Read the question.
Sir, classical murmur of HOCM, sir?
It will have ejection systolic murmur. Okay, it's a systolic murmur, and you can have the double apical impulse. So many double apical impulse. So many things are there. Okay, but generally you get a systolic murmur.
Okay.
Yes, who want to give away? Very possible station that can be asked even in your viva.
Bladder perforation.
Bladder perforation. Now,
Autonomic hyperreflexia.
perfect, excellent. Okay, so this is a classical example of autonomic hyperreflexia. Can you tell me briefly about that term?
When there is a spinal cord transection,
Okay, at
there
what
will be
level?
disinhibition.
At what level you get this autonomic hyperreflexia?
Mid thoracic levels, mid thoracic.
Okay, a patient is having a T10 transection of the cord. Will you get autonomic hyperreflexia in this patient? Okay, so generally, when the patient is having a spinal cord injury or a transection, a T6 and above. So below T6 is never happens. Okay, it happens only when the spinal cord transection is above the T6 level, because the splanchnic vessels or the splanchnic ganglion, it's got 3 ganglion there: greater splanchnic ganglion, lesser splanchnic ganglion, and the least splanchnic ganglion. So these splanchnic ganglion sympathetic nervous fibers arise from T6 to T12. Okay, so these splanchnic vessels sympathetic nerve fibers are the main reasons for triggering this autonomic hyperreflexia. Okay, so that's the reason why only spinal cord injuries above T6 level you get autonomic hyperreflexia. Okay, and why this splanchnic vessel I explain now soon. Okay, so you know what is autonomic hyperreflexia? Right, no idea what is autonomic hyperreflexia. Right.
Disinhibition, central inhibition is lost. There will be reflex stimulation
Okay.
from the
No worries, no problem. Leave it. I'll explain. Right. Say, for example, this patient has got a transaction at the level of T4. Okay, which means below that the cord is useless, completely nothing. Now this patient has come for the cystoscopy because the ureter catheter got blocked. So what happens when you inflate the patient, the bladder, under sedation? You're not giving any anesthesia, just under sedation. You are introducing a cystoscope. Okay, now the bladder is getting distended. Okay, so normally when the bladder is getting distended, what happens? It will stimulate the stretch receptors or the sympathetic nervous system, which is supplying the bladder. So this sympathetic nervous system is normally under the control of parasympathetic nervous system from the brain. Okay, so brain will have a suppression of the sympathetic system activation by stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system in the cranium as well as in the sacrum. So parasympathetic nervous system starts from craniosacral outflow by 3, 7, 9, 10 cranial nerves. Okay, and the sacrum starts from S2, S3, S4. So these are the nerves which is responsible for the parasympathetic system, and the sympathetic nervous system works from T S2 to L2. Okay, right. So when the patient is having a bladder distension, what happens, this sympathetic system gets activated. Normally, this activation of sympathetic system will ascend the response to the brain. Okay, the brain will activate the parasympathetic system. That will come down through the cords and will activate this parasympathetic system, which is supplying the cords that will relax. So this is normally happening in the brain. In a patient with spinal cord injury, what happens, when you distend the scope, okay, when you distend the bladder, this sympathetic nervous system signals are normally conducted across to the brain by the peripheral vessels or the peripheral nerves. There is no doubt in that. Okay, the sympathetic system will conduct the impulses to the brain. The brain will sense a distension and will send the parasympathetic nervous system to counteract the response. But the problem is this parasympathetic nervous system doesn't reach down because the cord is getting completely affected here. So when the parasympathetic system is not reaching here, there will be uncontrolled sympathetic activation below the level of cord. Whatever the parasympathetic system activation is done above the level of cord will stimulate the part of the body which is not blocked. Unmute and tell me whether you have understood this point slowly. You want me to repeat again? Is that clear, or you want me to tell it again?
Sir, your voice was breaking at the end.
Okay, fine.
Please
So,
repeat it, sir.
one final moment. All right. Right. So T4 is blocked. Okay. Now the bladder is getting distended. Okay. When the bladder is distending, okay, there will be local release of sympathetic hormones. Okay. So that will send the response to the brain. Okay. The brain, what it do in order to counter the sympathetic response, it will activate the parasympathetic system in the brainstem. Okay. So that parasympathetic system will send the signals through the spinal cord, and the parasympathetic supply for the bladder is going to be S2 and S3, S2, S3 and S4. So this will get activated. So that will come back and counteract the distension. So that is how the reflex is completed. But in a patient with spinal cord injury, what happens, the sympathetic system is activated. There is no doubt in that. So that will stimulate the brain. Brain will activate the parasympathetic system. But the problem is this parasympathetic system is not reaching below the blocked part. So what happens? Below the blocked region, there will be uncontrolled activation of sympathetic nervous system because this is not getting blocked. Above the heart or above the T4 level, whatever the body is having the parasympathetic system, all those get stimulated. So above the part where the spinal cord is injured, there will be uncontrolled parasympathetic system activation. Below the level of cord, uncontrolled sympathetic activation. Right. So when there is an uncontrolled sympathetic activation, what will be the hemodynamic response below the level of cord? You can tell me now. Vasoconstriction, hypertension, cold extremities, failure. When there is an uncontrolled parasympathetic system activation above the level of cord, there will be vasodilatation, bradycardia, flushing, headache, nasal congestion. Got it? This is autonomic hyperreflexia.
Sir, please repeat the symptoms, sir.
Below the level of cord injury, there will be uncontrolled sympathetic activation. The reason we spoke already. So when there is uncontrolled sympathetic activation, you'll have a vasoconstriction below the level of cords, like in the legs, in the lower abdomen, everything there will be vasoconstriction. Similarly, the sympathetic the splenic circulation go for complete vasoconstriction, right? So there will be hypertension below the level of cord injury. Like for example, if you measure the blood pressure in the legs, there will be very high blood pressure. Since there is a vasoconstriction, there will be peripheral pallor and there will be cold extremities. Okay. Above the level of cord, there is uncontrolled parasympathetic system activation. So that will produce bradycardia, vasodilatation, flushing because of the increased vasodilatation, nasal congestion again because of increased vasodilatation, headache because of increased intracranial pressure secondary to vasodilatation. This happens above the level of cord injury parts. And hypotension. Good. So this is the
cumulative effect.
Sorry. Cumulative effect,
Sir, what will be the
uncontrolled. Cumulative effect, uncontrolled. There can be intracranial hemorrhage. There will be seizures that can result in cardiac arrest. So it is a serious condition. It is a life-threatening condition, right? So what is the immediate management? Deflate the bladder. Okay. So deflate, remove the cystoscopes, deflate the bladder immediately. Taking away the response which is stimulating this autonomic hyperreflexia is the first thing you do. Definitive treatment, use vasodilators, because only the unopposed vasoconstriction is stimulating the brain. So when you use a vasodilators, that can relax the lower vessels, that can relax it can reduce the amount of sympathetic response which is stimulating the brain. So vasodilators like calcium channel blockers, nitroglycerides, hydralazine can be tried. So this is the definitive management of autonomic hyperreflexia. Generally happens only when there is a cord injury T6 and above. Good. Any questions here?
Sir, drugs like clonidine and dexmedetomidine, are they contraindicated in this
It
condition?
is not contraindicated, but it's not been tried because they themselves have got a potential to produce bradycardia. And most important thing, the dexmedetomidine or clonidine, the initial response is going to be the hypertension because they'll stimulate the peripheral alpha 1. That can eventually result in a catastrophe.
So no anesthetic drugs with relative contraindications.
Yeah, you have to use only vasodilators. Coming to anesthetic point of view, okay. So any drugs which can cause a peripheral vasodilatation can be used when it comes to the anesthesia drugs basically. But the most important thing, remove the trigger first, find the trigger first. So that is why when the patient who has got a paraplegia coming for any surgery, like it could be bladder surgery or it could be a bed sore surgery, never ever give the patients without anesthesia, don't do the surgery. The best anesthesia to avoid all those things is going to be either under spinal or epidural. It's not that you cannot use GA, but spinal and epidural anesthesia will completely blunt this hyperreflexia. So just because the patient is paralyzed doesn't mean that the patient will not have any pain at all. The patient will have the sympathetic response will be intact. So always anesthetize the patient, whatever the procedure the patient comes for, below the level of spinal cord injury.
How to treat bradycardia?
Bradycardia is nothing but a reflex response. Okay, only when you cut off the stimulus, the bradycardia will get corrected. You need not specifically correct bradycardia. Stop the stimulus, stop the triggering stimulus, heart rate will automatically come down back.
So how does basal gyrus reflex occur?
Sorry? Louder and clear.
Basal gyrus reflex.
Basal gyrus reflex. Basal gyrus reflex is sudden decrease in the venous return. Okay, when there is acute decrease in venous, for example, if your patient is coming for shoulder surgery, what happens? They generally do in a beach chair position. So when you intubate the patient, you are giving all anesthesia drugs. Patient is maintained under sevoflurane. So all the reflex vasoconstrictor response is lost. So in those patients, when you put the patient in a beach chair acutely, suddenly, what happens? At the inguinal level or the hip level, there is a constriction. The venous return from the legs is not reaching the heart. So when the venous return is acutely decreased, normally you expect a reflex tachycardia, right? But in patients where the patients have got blunted because of anesthesia, that acute decrease in the venous return will produce paradoxical bradycardia. That is called basal gyrus reflex.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Good. Let's move on to next station. Right. Read the question and you can start.
Sir, is this ARDS, sir? Acute
Yes.
respiratory distress?
Okay, this is ARDS. Perfect. What is the name of the criteria to diagnose this condition?
Sir, so far
Yes.
score.
Berlin's criteria.
Okay, good. Okay,
Berlin's
that's-
criteria.
There are two criteria, American Society criteria, and second thing is going to be the Berlin's definition or the Berlin's criteria. Excellent. I hope you all know what is Berlin criteria. So acute onset within 1 week, then PA-FO to ratio. The most important thing removed from the Berlin criteria is older criteria, they have the pulmonary artery occlusion pressure, which is less than 18 or the wedge pressure. But this criteria is not included in the Berlin's definition. So any clinical evidence that which can't be explained by heart failure, that all comes under Berlin's definition. So there is this PaO2 criteria is going to be, the PaOF or the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure criteria is removed in the Berlin definition. That's only different. Okay, what is the effective treatment for ARDS? One and one
Sir,
definitive treatment.
Sir, invasive ventilation, sir, if it
Uh,
satisfies the criteria.
More than invasive
Lung
ventilation.
protective ventilation.
Yes,
Low
that word is
tidal volume.
important. Okay, that word is important. It
But
is called
that
as
is only possible when patient is intubated, right? Sir?
yeah. Patient is intubated, right? You have to intubate in a patient's ARDS. It's very difficult.
Yes, sir.
Eventually, everyone will land up in having an intubation. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So
Sir, low tidal volume,
it is
lung
called
protective
as the
ventilation.
lung protective ventilation strategy. Okay. So of all the treatments tried in ARDS, this is the only one which is found to have survival benefit. Rest all treatment are only no any evidence that the patient will survive or not. So lung protective ventilation strategy is the only strategy which can make the patient to survive. Right. What is basically the lung protective ventilation strategies?
Sir, proning position, sir, first.
No.
Tidal
See, first tell the
10
basic.
ml per kg.
First, tell the basic things. When it comes to lung protective ventilation, if you tell proning, it might reflect very bad in your exam. First, tell the basic things. What is the lung
Low
protective-
tidal volume ventilation, sir.
When you tell low tidal volume, be more precise.
So
4 to 6 ml per kilo.
4 to 6 ml per kg. Got it.
6 to 8 ml per kg. Okay, 6 to 8 ml per kg is a tidal volume you have to start with. Then
Peak airway pressure less than 35, plateau pressure less than 25 centimeter.
peak airway pressure less than 35 centimeters of pressure. Then plateau
Plateau
pressure
pressure less than
less
20.
than 20.
less than 30 centimeters of water. Okay, so these are the things we aim for lung protective ventilation strategy, which this you can manipulate the respiratory rate and the PEEP. By adjusting the PEEP and the respiratory rate, you can manipulate these findings in such a way that the pH should be maintained between 7.3 to 7.45.
Okay, sir.
7.45. So this is the pH you have to target for. So unless the pH is more than 7.35, you can manipulate with this respiratory rate and the PEEP such that these targets are achieved. So the main reason for low lung protective ventilation strategy is high tidal volume is going to produce alveolar break. When there is an alveolar break, there is going to get inflammation or the biotrauma. When there is inflammation, the air is getting more severe. Patient are going eventually dying. So that is why low tidal volume ventilation strategy came into existence. Okay.
Yes.
Good. So apart from these things, they might not ask you anything in ARDS. So many trials, so many things are going on, but nothing is proven to be effective. One of the lung protective ventilation strategies is the only one which has got survival benefit in patients. So again, other things they can ask you is what are the criteria to tell ARDS? Next thing, what is the reasons for pulmonary and extrapulmonary causes for ARDS? So this
Sir,
patient,
grading of ARDS is on PF ratio, sir.
yeah, it is going to be mild, moderate, severe based upon the PF ratio. Between 200 to 300 is going to be mild, 100 to 200 moderate, less than 100 is going to be severe.
Yes.
So again, the other thing they can ask you is definition, different criteria. Since you know I didn't tell that, then causes, pulmonary causes and extrapulmonary causes. So this patient is an extrapulmonary causes. So what is the reason for this patient having ARDS?
Pancreatitis.
Good. Pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is one of the very, very vital cause for ARDS and extrapulmonary cause for ARDS. Good. The most important extrapulmonary cause is sepsis. Okay. Pancreatitis.
Sir, most specific biomarker will be procalcitonin, sir.
Nothing,
Nothing, sir.
nothing.
Sir, if it is a transmission-related acute lung injury, how can we differentiate from
It is
the?
transfusion-related acute lung injury is only a diagnosis of exclusion. Okay. Generally, transfusion-related acute lung injury develops within 48 hours of transfusion. Okay. 48 to 72 hours. Okay. Even then, you can't tell that it is going to be transly unless you exclude other causes for ARDS.
Sir, please tell about your modes of ventilation in ARDS. Brief, sir.
Newer modes of ventilation is, there are so many. Most important which you could remember is inverse ratio ventilation, like IE ratio getting less than 1:1. Other more inverse, other important newer mode of ventilation is APRV. Don't worry about these things. If you didn't mention the name, that is fine. Then prone ventilation, then one lung ventilation, and lastly, open lung ventilation. So these are the newer modes of ventilation which is being tried, but none has got so many, none has got a significant improved benefit. But these are things which have been tried successfully in few patients. Inverse ratio, APRV, prone ventilation, one lung ventilation, and open lung ventilation.
Sir, does ECMO have any survival benefits, sir?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Sir,
As I
the
said,
same question.
except lung protective ventilation strategy, none of the trials, none of the treatments have improved the survival benefits in patients.
Okay, sir.
Sir, if the same question was given without that time frame, can we write aspiration pneumonia as a possible cause?
Yes,
Because
if they give a differential diagnosis, you can write aspiration pneumonia. Yes, of course. But eventually, aspiration pneumonia will eventually cause ARDS at some point. So even what they expect is basically to tell you about, discuss about the ARDS. Right, next question here. Who want to take up, breathe and take up fast?
I will volunteer, sir.
Yes, please. Yes, rest all, please put your mic on mute.
This is a case of pheochromocytoma.
This is a case of pheochromocytoma. Excellent. You can unmute yourself again, but I've just muted. Right. So this is a pheochromocytoma. So it is characteristically present with paroxysmal headache, palpitation, high blood pressure, and sweating, which is hyperspiration. So this is the classical picture in a patient coming with pheochromocytoma. What are drugs you initially contraindicated to control the high blood pressure? Understand the word initial.
Initially beta blockers
Okay,
are
so
not given
selective beta blockers has to be avoided. Why?
because uncontrolled alpha action will.
Okay,
rise
so the selective beta blockers has to be avoided because selective or non-selective beta 2 blockers has to be avoided because there will be unopposed alpha 1 constriction that can enormously increase the blood pressure. What is the criteria we call to use for the adequate surgical preparation?
Roisen's.
Okay, that is called as the Roisen's criteria. Can you tell me what is Roisen?
No idea.
Okay, so there are three criteria. One is the blood pressure should be less than 160 over 90 millimeters of mercury at least 48 hours before surgery, right? Of course, this is older criteria. Now the criteria has changed to 130 over 80, but don't tell that in the exam. This is most recent evidence. So 160/90 in the exam, if you tell, that is fine. Second criteria, patient should have an orthostatic hypotension, but the blood pressure should not drop less than, or the systolic blood pressure should not drop less than 80. Orthostatic hypotension, there will be 15% decrease from the baseline. That is the second criteria. Third one, ECG should be free of STT changes for minimum 2 weeks. These are the three main criteria. The VPCs has been completely removed now. So blood pressure less than 160 over 90 at least 48 hours before surgery. Orthostatic hypotension defined as 15% reduction from the baseline systolic blood pressure, and the systolic blood pressure should not be dropping more than 80. Systolic blood pressure should not be less than 80. And lastly, ECG criteria, which clearly shows that no STT changes minimum for 2 weeks before surgery. So this is the Roisen's criteria. Right. What are the drug of choice to manage intraoperative resistive hypotension? Can you tell me what are the reasons for intraoperative hypotension in these patients?
Because the receptors are more sensitive when the tumors is removed. Then
okay, so when the tumor is removed, okay, the moment where there is complete no hormones are sympathetic hormones are there. So when tumor is removal, you get hypotension. Then any of the reasons for intraoperative hypotension?
Bleeding.
Down regulation of receptors.
Hypovolemia and good, and bleeding. Then
down regulation of receptors.
Good. Down regulation of receptors. Then
plasma volume is less in these patients.
Okay, that's why. Okay, that's a hypovolemia. I mentioned that hypovolemia and bleeding. Lastly,
residual alpha blockade.
Good. Residual effect of blockers which use and residual effect of intraoperative hypotensive agents. So these are the four main reasons where the patient tend to have hypotension, right? If the patient is resistant to adrenaline, noradrenaline, what is the drug of choice for resistant hypotension?
Sodium nitroprusside.
Yeah, that will produce hypotension. Yes, it is going to be the vasopressin. So vasopressin is a drug of choice for resistant hypotensive patients. Mention few anesthesia drugs which are contraindicated or bit avoided in patients with pheochromocytoma.
The drug that
ketamine.
Okay, ketamine, good. Sorry. Pancuronium, good.
Anticholinergics.
Anticholinergics. Say anesthesia drugs predominantly.
So halothane.
Okay, halothane.
Atracurium.
Okay,
Atracurium.
any histamine releasing drugs. Okay, any histamine like
Morphine.
morphine, atracurium, mivacurium, all those drugs has to be definitely avoided. Very good. Any questions in here? Other things they might ask how to diagnose, right? What is the rate limiting step in adrenaline synthesis?
Thyroxine hydroxylase.
Good, tyrosine hydroxylase. Okay, so what is the primitive amino acid for synthesis of adrenaline hormones?
Tyrosine.
Not tyrosine.
Phenylalanine.
Okay, phenylalanine. From there, phenylalanine hydroxylase, you get tyrosine. From there, tyrosine hydroxylase, this is a rate limiting step. You get dopa. From there, dopa decarboxylase, you get dopamine. From dopamine hydroxylase, you get noradrenaline. Then phenylethylamine N-methyl transferase will produce adrenaline. So this is the synthesis of thyroid hormones. So this dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline are metabolized by monoamine oxidase and catechol O-methyl transferase that will result in vanillyl mandelic acid. Good. So they might ask you the metabolites. They might ask you about what are the hormones which is metabolizing the sympathetic hormones. Good. Any questions?
Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, when we are administering alpha, sir, beta, sir.
Yeah.
When we are administering beta blocker prior to alpha 1 blocker, then there may be high systemic vascular resistance. So our heart have to pump against the high resistance as there is already underlying cardiac dysfunction secondary to high systemic vascular resistance.
Yeah.
So that is one of the reasons why beta blocker is contraindicated prior to alpha 1 blocker.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to put the patient on alpha blockers. Okay. Establish the alpha blockers for minimum 2 weeks. Okay. After 2 weeks of alpha blocker therapy, the patient will have a full-blown alpha blocker establishment. So once alpha receptors are completely blocked, then you can start beta blocker for hypertension.
Okay, sir.
Good.
Sir, suppose this patient is like not for surgery or in hypertensive crisis, any management changes, sir, pharmacology?
What sort of pharmacological management are you going to change?
Like still we will go with labetalol and all, sir?
Yes,
like
labetalol can be used because it has got both alpha and beta blocking properties. So it can be used.
Okay, sir.
So selective beta blockers has to be selective beta to block it, preferably. Has to be completely avoided. Right. Who wants to start this session?
I will volunteer, sir.
Yeah.
DLT.
W-lumen tube, good.
Bronchial blockers.
Bronchial blockers.
Endobronchial intubation.
Endobronchial tubes, fine. So what are the different types of DLT you know?
Left and right.
Okay.
Robert Shaw.
Robert Shaw tubes. Right.
PVCs.
Robert Shaw tubes. There is no PVC tubes. The
Carlens.
Carlens and
White.
Okay.
Smith.
Rest all, please mute, guys. Please mute so that everyone can listen. And what are the bronchial blockers you have though?
EZ.
Aunt. Then
Cohen.
Cohen's,
Fuji. Univent. Fuji.
Univent. Yeah.
Fuji.
Fuji. Right. And lastly, endotracheal tube. Right. Good. Which side of DLT you choose and why? We discussed already. Anyway, for the sake of asking, I'm just put this question. What are the different, which size endotracheal DLT you choose and why?
Size is according to the height of the patient, sir. Male,
okay.
more than
for an adult male, it's going to be 39 or 41. For adult female, it's going to be 35 or 37. 37. Fine. Right. Which side you choose?
Right sided DLT.
Why?
Left side.
I will choose left side.
Left side DLT is.
Why? Okay. Please, others, please be quiet. Please. Extremely please. Why do you want to choose right sided dog?
So, but in this case, left side is preferable because
Okay,
it is
can
easier
you-
to use. And if
Patient,
the in
patient is
right
going
side
to have
DLT,
patient is going to have left upper lobectomy. But do you think you can't operate that with the left side DLT?
we can operate, sir, because
why
if
do you
you
want to
use
choose?
right, there will be the upper lobe ventilation will be difficult, but still we can use left-sided in this case
Okay, so why upper lobe ventilation is difficult?
because it is more angulated and it the right upper lobe branchial branch comes very close to the it is very near to the carinal limb.
Okay, it is just at a distance of how much? 2.5 centimeter. Okay, whereas left upper lobe bronchus is at a distance of 4 centimeter. So this margin of safety is there when you use a left-sided double lumen tube. So what happens, when you use a right-sided double lumen tube, the right upper lobe bronchus appears at an angle of shorter distance. So when you put a right-sided double lumen tube, the cuff can obstruct the right upper lobe bronchus, and that can result in atelectasis. So that is why whenever you get a chance, left-sided double lumen tube is preferably preferred. There are certain indications where you can use right-sided double lumen tube. For example, when the patient is going to have left pneumonectomy, or when the patient is having left main bronchus is going to get completely scarred or shrinked, or when the patient is having aortic aneurysm. In those cases, you are left with no other choice. You have to use a right-sided double lumen tube. Good. Excellent. So how do you differentiate right-sided double lumen tube from a left-sided double lumen tube?
An extra Murphy size for the right upper lobe is there.
Okay. More than that, most important thing.
Carinal hook, sir?
Now, carinal hook is there on both sides, mate. There is no carinal hooks in the double lumen tubes.
Shape of the
Deflection.
Shape of the cuff. Very good. Okay. It is rounded. Okay. The cuff will be rounded like this in a bronchial lumen in left-sided DLT. That's how you have to differentiate. Okay. Then in a right-sided DLT, it will be a pear-shaped cuff. The cuff will be like this. To have a separate hole for ventilating the right upper lobe bronchus. So pear-shaped cuff in the right double lumen tube, whereas a rounded cuff in patient with left double lumen tube. So that is the most clinching point to differentiate double lumen tube of left side and right side. Of course, the angulation. If it is right side angulated, it's going to be right side double lumen tube. But the pear-shaped cuff and a separate opening for right upper lobe bronchus is very specific for right-sided double lumen tube, and that's the best way to differentiate right-sided and left-sided DLT. So in your instrumentation, if they're given a DLT, they'll definitely ask you which side DLT it is. Okay, good. What is the volume of air to be inflated in the bronchial cuff?
2 ml.
Okay, 2 to 3 ml. Perfect. Few contraindications for lung isolation.
In the post-operative predicted FeO1 is less than 40%.
Okay, fine. So there are so many criteria there. It is a bit of a theoretical question. I thought of removing that. You can go and find what are the few contraindications, right? So, okay, this patient during the surgery, you're noticing saturation is going to 80%. How will you manage? Step 1.
Increase the FiO2 to 100%.
Good. FiO2 to 100%. First step. Second one.
Begin double lung ventilation.
Wrong. Absolutely wrong.
Check the position of the tube.
No, before that, manually
So
ventilate.
circuit we should check again from machine.
Manually ventilate. Okay, take the back from the machine, ventilate manually. Third thing, step number 3.
For the non-dependent lung.
Check the position. Oh my God. Check the position. Either by checking auscultation or by fiber optic. Check the position. That's the third and the most important thing you have to do. What is the fourth step?
Beep.
No.
Check circuit.
No. Check position, circuit, everything comes under 3.
Cuff inflation.
No.
Reduce the inhalation agents.
Inform the surgeon.
Inform the surgeon. No, he will kick you by this time.
Cardiopulmonary circulation.
Good. Establish circulation. Okay. Make sure the blood pressure is fine. Make sure the patient is having adequate volume. Okay. Hypovolemia is the next thing you have to address before going on to next thing. So circulation has to be proper. Make sure the patient not having hypotension. Make sure the patient having not other abnormality related to the circulation. What is step number 5?
Keep to the
Volatile anesthetic agent.
Peep to the lung which is ventilated. Okay, most important thing. Don't give PEEP to the non-ventilated lung. PEEP to the lung which is ventilated. So you have to apply PEEP of 5 to 6 centimeters of water. Then
CPAP to the non-ventilated.
CPAP, okay, CPAP of 1 to 2 centimeters of water for non-ventilated lung. People tell in opposite, okay, don't do that. So CPAP should be applied to the non-ventilated lung. Then
2-lung ventilation to the stomach.
okay, intermittent, okay, intermittent 2-lung ventilation, not continuous, intermittent 2-lung ventilation. Then
Permissive hypercapnia.
okay, permissive hypercapnia. Before that, now the patient is hypoxemic.
Change the mode of
positioning.
ventilation.
2-lung ventilation.
Pressure control ventilation instead of volume control ventilation.
Recruitment maneuver.
Now, the recruitment maneuver you've already done, man. PEEP and CPAP are the recruitment maneuvers.
Now definitive
Actual
ventilation.
occlusion of pulmonary vessel.
Oxygen insufficient of the surgical lung.
Occlusion of pulmonary vessel, major pulmonary artery of that lung. Okay, occlusion of the pulmonary artery which is not being ventilated. Lastly, complete double lung ventilation. So these are the 9 steps you have to follow in a patient who is having an intraoperative hypoxemia. Okay.
Sir, what is that occlusion of pulmonary artery? I didn't get it.
When the surgeon is operating, you can ask him to clamp the pulmonary artery which is not being ventilated. So when you clamp the pulmonary artery, all the blood vessels will be diverted to the lung which is being ventilated. So you can approximate the ventilation perfusion ratio.
So VQ mismatch is improved, sir, basically?
Yeah, to improve the ventilation perfusion match.
Sort of shunt. Great, sir.
Sorry?
Decrease the shunt, sir.
Yeah, decrease the shunt, basically. You are improving the ventilation perfusion matching.
Sir, what about oxygen insufflation to the lung that is getting operated, sir?
You're already ventilating with 100% oxygen, right? Why do you want to insufflate? I mean, to the lung which is not ventilated.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay, one possible option you can try, but it's not been given in any of the guidelines to give oxygen insufflation.
Sir, a few points on troubleshooting on malpositioning of DLT, sir.
Not necessary, mate. That time they were not going to that extent. So the positioning of the tube can be confirmed only by fiber optic bronchoscope. Clinically, you can't identify the malpositioning of double lumen tubes unless you have the fiber optic intubation. So in fiber optic intubation, when you put the fiber optic bronchoscope into the patient's trachea, this is the carina, this is right bronchus, and this is left bronchus. You have to visualize the bronchial cuff in just into the left main bronchus. So this is an ideal view for left-sided DLT. When you're putting a right-sided DLT, the cuff can be accepted to come into the carina like this. Okay. Whereas even if it is not inside the bronchial lumen, if it is inside the just close to the carina, it is acceptable in a patient with right-sided DLT. Whereas in a patient left-sided DLT, it has to be completely inside the bronchial lumen. That is the only way you can confirm the proper position. Clinically and all, it is completely useless.
Okay.
So troubleshooting, clamping, then inflating this cuff, then unclamping, then inflating that cuff, all are theoretical things which you can read easily. Do you want me to explain that now? I hope so. You can. You're comfortable with that.
Yes, sir.
Good. Let's move on to next station. Yeah, take up this question first.
I will volunteer, sir.
Yeah.
TURP syndrome.
Yeah, please, Rashal, please mute. So it's going to be TURP syndrome. Good. What are the reason for visual disturbance in this patient?
So the irrigating fluid containing.
When I say reason, there should be only one word.
Glycine.
Glycine. Glycine. Glycine toxicity is the most common reason where it can produce visual disturbances. What is the parasympathetic supply and sympathetic supply of the prostate gland?
The sympathetic supply is from T12 to L1,
L2, good. Parasympathetic,
S2, S3, S4.
okay. S2, S3, put until now, basically S2, S3, S4. What are the risk factors for developing this condition?
Risk factors, surgical factors like resecting more than 60 gram of prostate.
Okay,
and
more than 60 gram of prostate being removed. Okay, then
Operation duration more than 60 minutes.
duration more than 1 hour. Then
Then the height of the irrigating solution is more than 60 centimeter from pubic
okay,
symphysis.
60, 60, 60, easy to remember. So 60 minutes, 60 grams, 60 centimeter of height of the operating irrigation fluid. Then
The blood pressure, venous.
when the venous pressure is very low, anything which decreases the venous pressure, like patient is having hypovolemia, okay? Hypovolemia can increase the venous pressure down. So when the venous pressure is down, more and more fluid can get into the circulation. So any factors which is going to decrease the venous pressure. Then
Type of irrigating fluid used.
patient with CCF, okay? Patient with congestive cardiac failure, okay? Baseline residual function is very poor. So when the LV function is poor, okay, those patients are going to get high risk of developing this TURP syndrome. Good. These are the important risk factors, right? So what is the level of spinal anesthesia you target in a patient with TURP surgery when you're doing awake?
Less than T10.
T10.
Okay, what is the, that's the maximum level you reach. If you get less than T10, it's a shit, right? Why it is T10?
Because in case there is a bladder perforation, it can be detected.
Okay.
And second thing is the TURP mental changes can also be assessed.
Good. Right. I think that's a major thing they might ask you. What is the electrolyte disturbance they develop normally?
Sir, hypotonic hyponatremia.
Okay, hypotonic hyponatremia. Very good. Okay. Right. So this patient is having sodium of 1110. Okay. What is the important treatment you can do?
So this is severe hyponatremia and also the patient is, so I will replace with 3% sodium,
Okay.
hypotonic saline.
Okay, 3% hypotonic saline. So what will be your correction target?
Correction target will be, sir, 120 or the patient should not be.
Okay, so never
acidic.
increase more than 8 milliequivalents in 24 hours. That's the most important thing. So if you rapidly increase the sodium, that can result in central pontine myelinolysis. So more than 8 milliequivalent should not be improved from, say, for example, if you're measuring after 24 hours, you can reach maximum only 118. So you have to calculate how much sodium to replace. Based upon that, you have to calculate your infusion rate and the type of fluid you're going to give. Okay. So target is not increase more than 8 milliequivalents in 24 hours. That's the most important thing. Apart from hypotonic saline, what are the treatments you can try?
So I will give, this patient has CNS symptoms, breathing difficulty. So we can give some diuretics.
Okay, you can give some furosemide. Okay, you can produce a free water loss so that the patient sodium can get back to normal range. Good. Any questions in this station? Rest all about TURP. Since it's a short case, you might be knowing many things. So that's why I didn't get into the discussion part. Good. Next question.
Sir, please mention about TURBT.
There's nothing significant about TURBT. Only thing you have to worry about TURBT is the adductor reflex. Okay. The adductor reflex when you touch the bladder's lateral wall of the bladder. Right. The obturator nerve travel very close to the lateral bladder. So when they use a resector scope here, when they touch the bladder wall, it can stimulate the obturator nerve and can produce adductor spasm. So you can use an adductor nerve block, obturator nerve block to avoid this reflex. That's the only additional point. There is nothing much difference when it comes to TURBT and TURP. Good. Who wants to volunteer this one?
Sir, I'll volunteer.
Yes. What is this congenital abnormality?
Down syndrome, trisomy
Excellent. So this is trisomy 21. Can you tell me some airway related issues in Down syndrome?
Atlantoaxial instability due to subluxation.
Simple things first, so order by order, from mouth.
High arched narrow palate.
Small mouth, okay.
Macroglossia.
Micrognathia, right? Then macroglossia. Okay, then in the nose, adenoid hypertrophy. Then, as I said, high arched palate. Then,
Subglottic stenosis.
okay. Fifth one,
Atlantoaxillary.
subglottic stenosis. Then, tracheomalacia. Then coming to the spine, atlanto-occipital instability. It is noted in nearly 20% of Down syndrome. And lastly, obstructive sleep apnea. So these are the different airway-related issues this Down syndrome can present to you, or they can cause a problem when they come for anesthesia. Good. Mention few cardiac.
Duodenal atresia.
That is not airway-related problem, isn't it? I mean, you're worried about aspiration. All right. So mention few cardiac abnormalities, doc.
Most commonly atrial septal defect.
Okay,
causing
endocardial cushion defects like atrial septal defect, ventricular septal defect. Initially, you can have the TOF, tetralogyophalate. All right. You can tell all this, congenital heart disease like ASD, VSD. PDA is not that common, and you can tell about TOF next. Good. So Down syndrome, other things, there's nothing to worry about. When its main problem is this airway-related issues, then delayed recovery from anesthesia, then they can have the communication issues. You can't communicate with them properly, so they can't tell about pain, they can't tell about shivering, and they're more prone for hypothermia. These are the key issues with Down syndrome.
Sir, consent in these patients will not be valid, no sir. Even if
They should have a proper another adult to give consent for these patients. Good. Right. Who wants to take up this station?
I will address.
Yes. What is the severity as per WHO classification?
This is moderate.
That is, what is WHO classification?
Sorry. Sir, 18.5 to 23.9 is normal BMI.
Okay.
24 to 26.29 is overweight. 30 to 34.9 is obesity, mild
obesity.
35 to
class 1.
35 to 40 is morbid obesity.
Class 2. There is nothing. See, when they say WHO classification, you have to tell what WHO tells. Okay. Class 2.
And 40 to 45.
Class 3. Okay. So what class does this patient come?
This patient come under 37, so grade 2.
Class 2 obesity. Okay. Or grade 2 obesity as per WHO classification. What are the score used in OSA?
Scores for risk scoring, bank risk, stop bank.
Stop bank. Okay. So stop bank scoring. I know you. I hope you know what is stop bank. Can you tell briefly about, explain what is stop bank?
Snoring, tiredness.
Snoring, tiredness. Observed sleep apnea.
Observed sleep apnea, pressure, blood pressure.
Blood pressure.
BMI.
BMI more than 35.
35.
Age more than 50.
Age more than 35. Neck
circumference more than 40. And gender. Male. Good. What is AH high?
This is apnea hypopnea index.
Okay. What is that basically?
The episodes of apnea divided by the episode of hypopnea.
What is the difference between apnea and hypopnea?
Stopping of breathing for more than 10 seconds.
Okay.
Complete cessation of breathing or partial cessation of
These are the three major differences. All right. So the airflow, okay, the airflow drops more than 80% in patients with apnea, whereas in hypopnea, it will be 30 to 70% reduction in the airflow. Second thing, there will be saturation drop, which is very severe. In patients experiencing hypopnea, there will be around more than 4% drop. It will be very severe in hypopnea. It will be for more than 10 seconds. It can be more than 10 seconds, or it can be equal to 10 seconds. Most important thing, apnea will be associated with arousal. The patient will suddenly wake up from sleep, whereas this can be associated or without associated arousal. These are the major difference between apnea and hypopnea. So you're going to calculate number of apnea, you're going to calculate number of hypopnea, calculate, add together, divided by number of hours of sleep will give you apnea hypopnea index. The main purpose of doing this is going to assess the severity of obstructive sleep apnea. Okay, can I grade the severity based upon AHI?
5 to 15 more than.
Less than 5 normal, 5 to 15 mild, 15 to 30 moderate, more than 30 severe. Okay, what is the best preoperative factor to assess the obesity related metabolic disorder? How can you tell this patient is likely to have all obesity related metabolic problems?
Hyperlipidemia.
No.
Waist ratio.
Sorry.
Abdominal circumference.
Good. Waist hip ratio. Excellent. Okay. Waist hip circumference or waist hip ratio. So waist hip circumference for men, if it is more than 102, and for female, if it is more than 88, these patients, because it is distribution of fat which is speaking, BMI will tell only about the total fat. It will not tell about distribution of fat. But the people who got it distributed among the waist, which we call them as the central obesity, those guys are more prone for metabolic disorders like dyslipidemia and the type 2 diabetes and all those things. So when you have a waist hip circumference of more than 102 in men and more than 88 in females, we call them as high risk for obesity related metabolic disorders. What is the preoperative test you assess the severity of OSA?
Polysomnography.
Excellent. Polysomnography. Can you tell me few drugs which is given based upon total body weight, few anesthesia drugs which is given based upon ideal body weight?
Total body weight is only succinylcholine and remiperidone.
Succinylcholine. All right. Then
Remiperidone.
Neostigmine.
Propofol
Then
maintenance dose.
maintenance dose of propofol. Very good. Maintenance dose of propofol. Okay. Bolus dose of midazolam. Right. See the things which are given based upon the total body weight. Ideal body weight, fentanyl. Majority of the opiates are given on ideal body weight. Fentanyl, morphine, then bolus dose of propofol, maintenance of midazolam, exactly opposite. Okay. Midazolam, then procuronium. These are the drugs which are given in based upon the ideal body weight or lean body mass. Okay, ideal body weight is given by lean body weight plus 10 to 20% of lean body weight. So this is a way to calculate ideal body weight. Right. Good. Any questions in obesity?
Sir, how to calculate lean body weight?
Ideal body weight plus another 20% of ideal body weight. Sorry, ideal body weight gained by lean body weight plus 20% of lean body mass.
Sir, how to calculate lean body weight, sir?
That's a big calculation. Some age square, height square. It's very difficult. It's a mathematical calculation.
But sir, how to know about the lean body weight? There's some.
There are. If you know the age, height, and weight, okay, there are calculators which you feed them that will give you the lean body mass, lean body weight.
Okay. Sir.
Sir, where is predicted body weight used, sir?
Predicted body is used when you are using the lung protective ventilatory strategy.
Okay, sir.
The predicted body weight is same as ideal body weight, right, sir?
There will be a subtle difference, right? There just 5 to 7 kilogram difference will be there, but never bother about those things, man. No worries.
Sir,
Instead of giving 300, if you're going to give 350, patient not going to die. Don't worry. Yes, but yes, doctor.
Sir, intrafluid, sir, fluid based on which body weight, sir? Lean or
intrafluid based upon these patients, their total body volume is very high. Okay, so that has to be given based upon the total body weight.
okay.
Good. Can I say this? Who want to take a very, very interesting station? The cardiac arrest algorithm or ACLS algorithm kept in the exam will be very easy. I'm just keeping the algorithm which you find or you tend to forget. Okay.
PES, pulseless electrical activity.
Okay. So first question, there you find a definitive pulse, but breathing is adequate. This is a 4 years old kid. What is your next step on your arrival at the scene? That is the first question.
Assist breathing.
Patient is having a definitive pulse. Geo, but this is only for the second question. This is not for the first question. You got a definitive pulse. Breathing is inadequate. What is your next step?
Oxygen. Back more.
Okay, very good. The first step you have to give assisted breath. Okay, you have to
Rest of
assist the
breaths.
breathing. At what rate?
Unbreath every 5 to 6 minutes.
Okay, that is older version.
One breath every 2 to 3 seconds.
Okay,
And
one
then
breath,
breaths.
one breath every 2 to 3 seconds. Okay,
2 to 3 seconds.
that is the latest ACLS guideline. So
And
one breath every 2 to 3 seconds. You have to assist for 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes, and then reassess the baby. Okay, after 2 minutes, you are reassessing. Pulse is feeble. ECG is done. That is displayed here. What is your next action?
CPR.
Fluid,
CPR.
sir? IV fluid resuscitation?
CPR.
Now, you have to start CPR.
Chest compressions.
Why? Pulse is
Heart
feeble. Anyway, it is
rate less
present
than
but feeble.
60.
Good. Very good. Very important point. When the heart rate is less than 60 in pediatric patients, even though pulse is present or you're not conclusive about the pulse, start chest compression. Most important thing. To only to stress that point, I put this question. Heart rate less than 60 as per ACLS guidelines, irrespective of the pulse, start CPR. Good. Now CPR is ongoing. You have put an advanced airway, LMA, or if you put an endotracheal intubation is done. What will be the compression ventilation ratio for a 4 years old kid?
15:2.
15:2. No.
30:1.
So 30:2 single rescuers.
No.
10:2.
You're speaking about pediatric patients. What will be the compression?
10:2.
No. I have mentioned you have
This is the
established
compression factor. This is the
After-
compression 60%.
advanced airway is being established. That's the point you have to
Every
understand.
10 to 12 breath.
No, every
2 for single rescuer.
Compression should go at a rate of 100 to
100 to 120.
120 breaths per minute. Okay. Ventilation will be happening one breath every 2 to 3 seconds. So there is no relationship like you have to wait 15, then 2, 30, then 2. No. When the advanced airway is placed, compression will go at its own pace, ventilation will go on its own place. Understand this point. So you're compressing at 100 to 120 breaths per minute, and then you're going to ventilate one breath every 2 to 3 seconds, which means breath rate will be 20 to 30 per minute. Do you understand this point, guys? Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Because when there is no advanced airway, I know you know that it's 15 to 30 to 1%, 2%, all those things you know. I understand that. I've just specifically mentioned advanced airway is placed. Now what will be the compression ventilation? Once you put an advanced airway, forget the 30:2, 15:2. It is all lost. Now it is going to be compression at 100 to 120 breaths per minute. For adults, it is going to be 10 to 12 or one breath every 5 to 6 seconds. For pediatrics, it is going to be one breath every 2 to 3 seconds. Understood? Understand the difference. Okay. Now the advanced airway is in place. IV access is obtained. Invasive artery line is placed. What is the recommended diastolic pressure you target for successful CPR for a 4 years old kid?
More than 20.
That's 40, sir.
More than 20. More than 20.
40 mm.
Okay.
20%.
Okay. For infants, you have to target 25 millimeter of mercury for diastolic blood pressure. I'm telling diastolic pressure. For pediatrics, okay, for children's, like this is a 4 year scale, it is a children. So you have to target 30 millimeter of mercury diastolic pressure. This is based upon ACLS 2020 guidelines. Okay. So this is the most recent. Good. Patient is asystolic despite giving fluids. Adequate CPR. and adequate adrenaline. Everything is going on fine. What will you do when the patient is having a resistant shock? Read this patient case history and then tell me.
Hydrocortisone.
Double defibrillation, sir.
Hey, patient is in asystole.
Read
If
the
you say
cause.
defibrillation, then you don't understand the basic concept of ACLS.
Treat the cause.
Read. Hydrocort, very good. Hydrocort, excellent. Because this baby is having sepsis, okay? You have to give hydrocortisone for resistant septic shock. Excellent. Any doubt in this station?
Sir, double defibrillation is now not advocated in recent.
No. In asystole, why do you want to defibrillate?
Yes, sir.
Patient is in asystole, I mentioned, right? If you say defibrillation asystole, that is going to reflect very bad in the exam. Never ever. Defibrillation, only 2 rhythms, pulseless ventricular tachycardia and VF. At any other point, never utter the word defibrillation, okay? Good. Who wants to start this station?
Shall I?
Yeah.
It is Child-Pugh score and
Okay.
MELD.
Child-Pugh score and
MELD.
MELD. What is MELD?
Model for end-stage liver disease.
Okay, model for end-stage liver disease. So go and find what are the criteria included here and what are the criteria for model for end-stage liver disease. Ideally, model for end-stage liver disease is to predict the mortality in a patient's waiting for liver transplant. Okay, it is not ideal for liver cirrhosis. But anyway, those are 2 scores used clinically. All right. What are the factors which increases the risk of thrombosis in this patient?
So patients can have coagulopathy.
Yes. What are the factors which increase the risk of thrombosis? I know that everyone knows what is the reason for bleeding, but I'm asking what are the reason for thrombosis in this patient? Liver failure patients are also more prone for deep vein thrombosis. This you wouldn't have heard, isn't it? That's why
Sir,
I just put the
carcinoma, sir,
question.
because carcinoma is.
Sorry.
Protein C proteinase deficiency.
Good. Number 1, decrease in protein C, protein S deficiency, and antithrombin 3 deficiency. All the 3 factors are produced by liver. So that will increase the risk of thrombosis. Then low plasminogen. No plasminogen. Okay. Then elevated von Willebrand factor in liver failure. So these are the 3 reasons why the patients tend to have risk of thrombosis. If you ask risk of bleeding, I know you'll be knowing it's going to be low coagulation factors, all blah blah reasons, low platelet inhibition, all reasons you know, I understand. So that's why I put increased risk of thrombosis. So low protein C, protein S, and antithrombin 3, low level of plasminogen, and elevated von Willebrand factor. These are the reasons which makes a patient risk of having thrombosis. Okay, mention few pharmacokinetic alterations in chronic liver disease.
First, absorption.
Volume of distribution.
Yeah, first thing, most important thing, increased volume of distribution. Very good.
Protein binding is
Okay.
Low albumin.
Low albumin, so low protein binding, so increased free fraction of drugs. Then
decreased metabolism.
Decreased metabolism of drugs or decreased excretion. Very good. If we mention these 3 factors, that is more than enough in the exam. Excellent. What is the point of care test to assess the coagulation status? Thromboelastograph. Excellent. Lovely. Mention few anesthesia drugs in liver failure you have to use carefully.
Benzodiazepine.
Thiopentone.
Halothane. Benzodiazepines. Morphine. Okay. Pancuronium, rocuronium can be used, should be used cautiously. Right. So it's very good that you know majority of the drugs which has to be used cautiously in the liver. Perfect. Any question here?
Sir, inhalational agent which will be ideal.
You can use sevoflurane. So one, the basic concept is one which preserve the hepatic arterial buffer response. Okay. Except halothane, majority of them preserves very well hepatic arterial buffer response. So you can use.
Many books mention isoflurane. So now because we have sevoflurane and desflurane, so all 3 are almost equal, right?
Okay, yeah, you can use any of this except halothane.
Okay, sir.
Sir, can you elaborate
Sir,
on
is this
the
buffer
cut-off
sir?
response?
Sorry.
Sir, is this buffer response is same as a regional blood flow?
Yeah, exactly the same.
So can you explain this buffer response?
That's a theoretical question, but it's there. They are given in the book, major textbook. Don't worry, you can refer it. Right. What is this equipment? I just want to put specifically this equipment because I had a hard crunch that you might get this one.
Target control.
So TCA.
TCA pump.
It is a TIVA pump. Okay. Target are total intravenous anesthesia pumps. So these pumps are different from the conventional infusion pumps. Okay. They are not same as the conventional infusion pump. They are different pumps. So that's why I put it here. So these pumps are called as target control infusion pumps or TIVA pumps. Good. What is CSHT?
Context sensitive.
Context sensitivity half-life.
Okay. I hope you know what is the definition of context sensitive half-life. So I'm not going to ask you. What is the context sensitive half-life of propofol?
40 minutes for 8 hours.
40 minutes for 8 hours. 20
If it
minutes
is less
for
than 3 hours, it is 10 minutes.
okay, 10 minutes for 4 hours. What is the context sensitive half-life for remifentanil?
It is only 3 minutes, sir, whatever the dose,
Okay,
however
3
the
to
duration.
4 minutes. What is the context sensitive half-life of fentanyl?
45 minutes.
250 minutes. Okay.
40 minutes.
240 minutes or 250 minutes. Okay. Right. If you remember propofol and remifentanil, that is more than enough in the exam. What is the recommended plasma concentration for propofol for general anesthesia?
50 to 75 microgram per kg.
Plasma concentration, doc, not
2 to 5
infusion.
nanograms.
150 to 300 mics per kg per.
Okay, that is infusion dose. Understand the question. So this should be the target plasma concentration for an adequate general anesthesia. For sedation, okay. For remifentanil, of course, they are not using in India. For remifentanil, it is going to be 3 to 6 nanogram per ml. Nanogram. It is not microgram. It is nanogram. So these are the different plasma concentration which you are targeting for. Can you tell some of the infusion models used in the TIVA pumps for propofol?
Marsh
Marshall.
model, Minto,
Schneider.
Snyder and Minto. Yes, sir.
Good. Propofol, you got adult and pediatrics. For adult, you got Marsh, you got Schneider. For pediatrics, you got Pete Fuser and you got Kataria. For remifentanil, it is Minto. So these are the different models available in the target control infusion pumps. I don't know, there are so many institutes which have started using TIVA pumps. For people who are not using TIVA pumps, remember these names, okay? Can you tell me what is Bristol regimen?
Ten milligram per kg per hour.
Okay, well, when do you use Bristol regimen actually? What is that basically?
When we don't have TCA, sir, when you have
So when you
regular
don't
pump.
have, when you have a conventional pump, when you don't have a TIVA pump, so manually you can try to maintain this concentration by using Bristol regimen. So regimen is step 1, 1 milligram
10
per
to 8
kg,
to 6.
1 milligram per kg bolus, followed by immediately you start 10 milligram per kg per hour infusion for 10 minutes. Then 8 milligram per kg per hour for 10 minutes. Then 6 milligram per kg per hour continuously. So this is Bristol regimen. This can maintain the plasma concentration around 3.5 to 4 micrograms per ml. Good. This is the Bristol regimen used for people who are not having TIVA pumps. Any questions here? With this, I come.
TIVA and TCA pumps are different, sir. Basically,
they are different. Okay. TIVA is nothing but total intravenous anesthesia. We give TIVA by using TCA pumps. Total TIVA is not a pump; it is a mode of anesthesia.
So the equipment is TCA pump.
Equipment is called as the TCA pump, target control infusion pump, but it is also colloquially called as the TIVA pumps.
Okay, sir.
Good guys. With this, I complete my exam course.
Did we skip to 27?
27th station.
Yes, sir. We skipped 27.
We skipped 27. Is it so? Oh, we didn't discuss this one. All right, fine. Huh. Right. What is this station?
Sepsis.
Okay. Answer me. The first question.
Bundle.
See, just selling, answering like a TV serial. Okay. Tell me one step. What is the next important step?
Sir, fluid resuscitations.
No.
Look for fluid responsiveness.
No. No. No.
Sepsis bundle.
Blood culture.
Hypovolemic.
Septic
Okay, what-
shock.
I'm not asking what is. Okay. What is sepsis bundle? What is the step one?
Collect the blood sample.
Sir, collect blood sample for
Collect for
Prophylactic antibiotics.
lactate. What is the second step?
IV fluid
Right.
resuscitation.
What is the second step? Send
culture,
lactate. What is
culture, blood culture.
Blood culture.
Culture fluids.
blood culture? What is the third step?
Antibiotics.
Broad spectrum antibiotics. What is the fourth step?
Fluid resuscitation.
Fluids.
Fluid investigation.
What is the fifth
Fluid.
step?
Vasopressor.
Vasopressor. Now tell me, where are we standing? Where are we standing in this patient?
Antibiotic
Third
spectrum.
third step.
Okay, so what is the third step then?
Prophylactic antibiotics.
Antibiotics. Start broad spectrum antibiotics. See, read the question. Every details is there. All details are there in the devil. Okay. So next step is going to be antibiotics. Step 3. Right. That is what they're asking you. This question is able to check your understanding of your sepsis bundle. What is the maximum amount of fluid you can give?
30 ml.
Excellent. Okay, 30 ml per kg is a fluid you can give maximally. Right. What is the target pressure you aim for?
MAP about 65.
greater than 90.
MAP
And
more
greater
than
than 60.
65.
Don't say systolic and all. That is not in the guideline. Tell what is there in the guideline. Okay, brother. Please don't tell any systolic. All shits. Mean arterial pressure more than 65 millimeters of mercury. Okay, this patient is very resistant. How will you manage?
Steroid administration.
Good. You have to give
No,
you have to give physiological dose of hydrocortisone. Okay. How much hydrocortisone? 50 milligram, 50 milligrams 6 hourly. So that is the physiological dose of hydrocortisone, which is given for resistant septic shock. What ventilator strategy you adopt?
Low tidal volume ventilation.
Similar to ARDS. Again, because when you use a high tidal volume, that can produce alveolar break and it can result in ARDS. So always lung protective ventilator strategy as you do in ARDS. So this is based upon the 2021 sepsis care bundle. Good. I hope there is no any questions in here, and we'll stop here. All the very best for your exams. Do very well.
Thank you.
Upload the video.
Yeah, I will upload the video. Don't worry. So all the very best.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank